A mother sitting in the front seat of her car, her eyes cold, unwavering, her fingers squeezing the trigger of a .22 caliber pistol. In the back seat, her 3 innocent children, Danny, Christy, and Cheryl, are terrified, unsure of what's coming next. One by one, she shoots them. First her son Danny, then Christy, and finally, Cheryl, her body lifeless as she slumps over. The chilling silence that follows is broken only by the distant sound of a woman, strangely calm, calling for help. What led Diane Downs to commit such a horrific crime, one that would haunt the nation? Before we dive into this shocking case, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss any chilling true crime stories like this one. If you're ready to uncover the dark details of this twisted story, let's begin. It was a picture-perfect family, or so it appeared. Diane Downs was a woman who fit the mold of the American suburban mother, attractive, well-groomed, and seemingly caring for her children. Living in the peaceful town of Springfield, Oregon, Diane was known for her charm, her smiles, and her apparent devotion to her 3 kids, Christy, Danny, and Cheryl. To outsiders, the Downs family lived an ordinary life, complete with school events, family dinners, and neighborhood gatherings. But beneath the surface, something was terribly wrong. Diane's life was a carefully curated performance, one that masked the chaos brewing within her mind. For months, those closest to her had noticed strange behavior, but no one suspected the horror that would unfold on the night of May 19th, 1983. At the time of the shooting, Diane was 27 years old. She had been divorced from her first husband, Steve Downs, who was the father of her children. Their marriage had been strained from the start, with Diane often accusing Steve of being distant and unemotional. Steve had once described her as needing constant attention, and their relationship ultimately crumbled under the weight of her demands. Yet, she remained a mother to her 3 children, often telling others how much she loved them, how they were her world. But this devotion, this picture of family harmony, was not as it seemed. Diane's romantic life had taken a darker turn after her divorce. She had a history of engaging in relationships with men who didn't quite live up to the expectations she set for them. And it was through one of these relationships that the unraveling began. Diane had begun a tumultuous relationship with a man named Don, a man who was one of the key players in her twisted mental landscape. Although Diane frequently claimed to have feelings for Don, their relationship was unstable and filled with emotional turmoil. She began to see him as the escape route from her frustrations, a way to liberate herself from the confines of motherhood and the life she had created. But this toxic relationship was far from being the sole trigger. It was merely the beginning of a much darker path. And Diane, seeking out attention from multiple men, had already begun hinting at a growing desperation to change her life. But instead of discussing her inner turmoil or seeking professional help, she harbored resentment. She became fixated on the idea of freedom, freedom from motherhood, freedom from the chains of responsibility. She no longer saw her children as a blessing, but as burdens. Behind closed doors, Diane's cold demeanor toward her children began to surface. In private moments, she was less patient, more distant. Those who knew her noticed the subtle signs of a woman at war with herself, but nobody could have predicted the violent explosion that would soon take place. The evening of May 19th seemed like any other. Diane had driven her 3 children to the home of a friend, Heather Plord, who lived on Sunderman Road. Diane and her children were supposed to drop off a newspaper article about horse rentals, something simple and innocent. But what happened next would shock the community and forever mark Diane Downs as one of the most notorious criminal mothers in American history. It was on this trip that Diane, seemingly out of nowhere, decided to commit the unthinkable. But the question remained. What drove her to pull the trigger, to endanger the very lives she once claimed to cherish above all else? As they made their way down Sunderman Road, the unthinkable happened. According to Christy Downs, who would later testify in court, the family was nearing a secluded spot on the road when Diane suddenly veered off course. Without warning, she pulled over to the side of the road, reached into the back seat, and pulled out a revolver. The same mother who had once doted on her children, who had once been the picture of maternal love, was now preparing to kill them. Christy, who was sitting in the front passenger seat, could hardly process what was happening. At that moment, Diane raised the gun and shot her son Danny first. Danny, only 3 years old at the time, was struck in the chest, but the bullet didn't immediately kill him. As he slumped forward, his mother turned the gun toward Christy and then to her youngest, Cheryl, who was sitting in the back seat. The violence was swift. 3 children, all shot at close range. The sound of gunfire echoed through the quiet countryside. The next moments were filled with chaos, confusion, and fear. Diane didn't seem panicked. In fact, according to witnesses, she appeared eerily calm in the aftermath. She calmly drove to a nearby location, a small service station, where she stopped the car and flagged down a passing motorist for help. It was a bizarre scene. Diane sat in the car, clutching her children, who were bleeding, while she calmly explained to a passing driver that they had been attacked. She told the stranger that a man had pulled up beside them in another vehicle and shot her children. It was an implausible story, one that was intended to shift the blame away from her. But as the minutes passed, the inconsistencies in her story began to mount. Diane claimed that the shooter had driven off, yet no one could confirm any details about this mysterious assailant. The authorities were soon called to the scene, and when they arrived, they were met with a scene of unspeakable horror. Danny, though critically injured, was still conscious, and his presence alone would soon become key to unraveling the mystery of that night. Cheryl, tragically, did not survive her injuries. She died in the back seat of the car, her life extinguished by the mother who should have protected her. And then there was Christy, barely alive, her chest riddled with gunshot wounds, but still clinging to life. As paramedics and law enforcement arrived, Diane seemed completely detached. She was not the grieving mother anyone expected her to be. There were no tears, no frantic pleas for help. Diane simply told the paramedics that the shooter had been a stranger, a faceless man who had driven by and fired into their car. The police, however, were already beginning to sense that something was wrong. They immediately noticed how strange Diane's demeanor was. Rather than displaying the shock and disbelief typical of a mother who had just witnessed the violent attack on her children, Diane seemed oddly composed. The inconsistencies in her story were glaring, and the initial suspicion began to form in their minds. Could the perpetrator be closer to home than Diane was letting on? What followed was an exhaustive investigation. Forensics would later reveal that the wounds inflicted on the children were too precise to have come from a random drive-by shooting. In fact, all 3 children had been shot from a close range, suggesting that the shooter had been in the car with them. With each new detail, the case grew more complex and more horrifying. Despite the mounting evidence, Diane continued to insist that a mysterious man had attacked her family. But the question lingered. If Diane had been telling the truth, why was she so calm, so collected in the aftermath of the brutal crime? Why had her children been shot in such a deliberate manner? And why was Diane's story so riddled with inconsistencies? As the investigation deepened, it became increasingly clear to law enforcement that the key to understanding what happened lay in one chilling possibility. The shooter may have been sitting in the car with the children all along. As detectives dug deeper into the investigation, they began to uncover disturbing truths about Diane Downs' personal life. While Diane's actions on the night of the shooting raised immediate suspicions, it was her life leading up to that fateful evening that revealed a more sinister picture. Diane had a history of failed relationships, but none more significant than the tumultuous relationship she had with her ex-husband, Steve Downs. They had been married for several years, but their relationship had deteriorated over time. Steve, a man who worked as a postal worker, had expressed concerns about Diane's behavior long before the tragic shooting. He had observed her growing distance from the children and her increasing obsession with her appearance, often at the expense of her family. Yet Steve had no idea just how far Diane's detachment would eventually go. The Downs marriage had ended in divorce, and during their separation, Diane became involved with a man named Robert Knickerbocker. Their relationship was far from typical. Diane had been open about her desire to have more children, and she often expressed her frustration that Knickerbocker was hesitant to start a family with her. But as their relationship progressed, Diane seemed to grow more obsessed with him, so much so that she began to exhibit erratic behavior. She would call him repeatedly, even at odd hours, desperate to get his attention. However, despite Diane's efforts, Robert eventually broke up with her, citing her increasingly unstable behavior as the primary reason for ending the relationship. This, detectives would later learn, was the final straw for Diane. She had already been facing a difficult personal situation, but Robert's rejection seemed to tip her over the edge. Diane had once told a friend that she would rather kill the children than have them grow up and be without a father. It became clear to investigators that Diane's emotional state had spiraled out of control, and the shooting of her children may have been a twisted response to her failure to keep the relationship with Robert intact. But there was more. Diane had been involved in a series of strange behaviors and decisions that further illuminated her potential motivations. In the months leading up to the shooting, Diane had been openly discussing her desire to adopt a child. This seemed to be a convenient plot for Diane, as her children, especially Danny and Christy, were becoming increasingly difficult to manage. Danny had developmental challenges, and Diane appeared to grow frustrated with his needs. Her desire for a perfect family seemed to conflict with the reality of raising 3 children, especially with her own emotional turmoil weighing her down. Moreover, Diane had become increasingly interested in the idea of finding a new, wealthy partner who would provide her with the lifestyle she had always wanted. She had previously made comments about her desire to be financially supported by a man who could give her the life she felt she deserved. Diane's fixation on material wealth and her need for a new partner may have contributed to the chilling act of violence she committed on the night of the shooting. As detectives began to piece together the pieces of Diane's life, they started to understand that the shooting of her children was not the random act of a desperate, loving mother trying to protect her family from a stranger. Instead, it appeared to be a cold, calculated move, one born out of resentment, frustration, and a deep-seated desire for control over her future. In an even darker twist, Diane had made several attempts to persuade others that her children's injuries were the result of a random attack. She had gone as far as to lie to the police and tell them that a man had pulled up beside her car and shot her children. But the evidence didn't add up. No one had seen the mysterious attacker, and witnesses reported that Diane's behavior in the aftermath of the shooting was far too composed to be that of a grieving mother. At the same time, police were questioning Diane's ex-husband, Steve Downs, who had been equally puzzled by his former wife's actions. Diane had shown no genuine concern for her children's welfare in the days following the attack, and Steve had grown increasingly alarmed by her apparent lack of remorse. Steve later revealed that Diane had made a comment to him shortly after the shooting, remarking that it wasn't a big deal and that she would be able to move on. This lack of empathy and the growing pile of evidence against her led detectives to believe that Diane was more than capable of committing such a horrific crime. Her own words, combined with her disturbing behavior, painted a portrait of a woman willing to sacrifice her children for her own gain. The most emotionally intense moment of the trial came when Diane's daughter, Christy Downs, was called to the stand. At only 8 years old, Christy had already lived through an unimaginable trauma. Her own mother, the woman who should have protected her, had shot her and her siblings. Despite her age and the overwhelming emotions she must have felt, Christy's testimony would become the key element in unraveling Diane's elaborate lies. Christy's appearance in the courtroom was not something anyone had prepared for. She was visibly distraught, clutching tissues as she entered the witness box, her face pale and tear-streaked. The room fell silent as the young girl took the stand. Christy's nerves were palpable. Her small hands trembled, and she had to pause several times during her testimony to gather her emotions. It was clear that the trauma she had endured was far from over. Fred Hugi, the prosecutor who had been assigned to the case, was the one who guided Christy through her testimony. It was a moment that was undoubtedly difficult for Hugi. He had worked with Christy and her brother Danny to help them recover from the events that had scarred them, and he had formed a bond with both children. Now he was tasked with helping the little girl relive the nightmare. Hugi began by gently asking Christy to recount her family's visit to the Plard home on the night of the shooting. Diane had been eager to make the trip, ostensibly to drop off a newspaper clipping for a woman named Heather Plard. As Christy recalled the night, the courtroom held its collective breath, waiting to hear her version of events. Christy was a child, yet her memories were clear, and every word she spoke cut through the courtroom like a sharp knife. She explained that after leaving the Plard residence, Diane had stopped the car on the side of a deserted road. At first, Christy didn't understand why. It was then that Diane turned around, looked at her children in the back seat, and shot them one by one. When Hughie asked her about her brother Danny, the boy who had been sitting next to her, Christy broke down in tears, her voice shaking. But she still managed to get out the words, "She shot Danny." It was here that the full horror of the situation became clear. Diane hadn't been caught up in a moment of panic or distress. She hadn't been acting out of fear or confusion. This had been a calculated, deliberate act. Christy's testimony made it impossible to believe anything other than that Diane had planned the shooting in cold blood. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was a mother who had made a decision to end her children's lives for reasons known only to her. Christy's testimony didn't stop there. She also confirmed the chilling detail that she herself had been shot by her mother. When Hughie gently asked, "Do you remember when you got shot?" Christy, with her small voice, nodded and responded simply, "Yeah." The courtroom gasped as she described how her mother had shot her, the pain, the shock, and how she had tried to protect her younger brother Danny. Christy's bravery in reliving the event, on the stand in front of an audience that included her mother, was nothing short of extraordinary. Perhaps most devastating of all was when Christy was asked who had shot her. With tears streaming down her face, Christy looked directly at her mother and responded in a quiet voice, "My mom." It was the moment that sealed Diane's fate in the eyes of the court. As Christy's testimony came to an end, she was embraced by Fred Hughie, who offered her a comforting hug before she was led out of the courtroom. But the damage had already been done. Diane's facade had been shattered. The truth was out. The evidence, combined with Christy's brave words, made it clear to everyone in the courtroom, Diane Downs was guilty. It wasn't just the testimony that convinced the jury. It was the fact that Christy, despite her trauma, had the courage to stand up in front of the world and speak the truth about what had happened. Her testimony had given voice to the suffering that she and her siblings had endured, and it left no room for doubt. As the trial progressed, the prosecution's case against Diane Downs began to take shape with mounting evidence that exposed the true nature of her actions on that fateful night. While Christy's testimony had provided an emotional and unambiguous account of the shooting, it was the painstaking work of investigators, combined with key forensic details, that would help build a rock-solid case for her conviction. The investigation into the murders was a mix of classic police work, psychological analysis, and close attention to the smallest details, all of which pointed back to one person, Diane Downs. In the early days of the investigation, Diane Downs had done what many suspects do in high-stress situations. She tried to maintain her composure, creating an alibi that she believed would shield her from suspicion. The story she told authorities was eerily rehearsed, even though it didn't match up with the facts. Diane claimed that she had been driving on a rural road when a man suddenly appeared, jumped into her car, and began shooting. Afterward, the man supposedly fled into the woods, leaving Diane to tend to her injured children. But there were immediate inconsistencies in Diane's narrative. For one, it was highly unlikely that a random stranger would attack her family in such a brutal manner, especially given the location, isolated and remote, but not devoid of potential witnesses. Diane was unable to provide any solid description of the alleged assailant, and there was no sign of a struggle or forced entry into the vehicle. Moreover, the location where the shooting occurred, a quiet country road, didn't match up with the kind of scene one would expect in an abduction-style shooting. Authorities began to seriously doubt Diane's account. Detectives scrutinized the details of her story and quickly found that her behavior in the aftermath of the shooting was out of step with what one would expect from a grieving mother. This dissonance became a key point in the investigation. After the shooting, Diane was rushed to the hospital where her children were treated. While the medical staff was focused on trying to save the lives of the 3 children, they couldn't help but notice Diane's odd demeanor. Nurse Rose Martin was one of the first to be struck by Diane's strange behavior. When Diane asked how the children were, Martin responded that the doctors were doing everything they could. Diane's reply was chilling in its lack of emotion. "Only the best for my kids," she said, followed by an unnerving laugh. "Well, I have good insurance." Her words weren't just strange, they were profoundly disconnected from the horrific reality unfolding in the emergency room. Diane didn't seem to be a mother in distress over her children's survival. Instead, she appeared almost indifferent. This behavior was noted by the medical professionals who treated her family, but it wasn't until further investigation that the full scope of Diane's actions began to make sense. Dr. John Mackey, who was overseeing the emergency care, was equally taken aback by Diane's composure. In his testimony, he recalled being struck by her calm demeanor during what should have been an emotional and chaotic moment. "She was extremely composed," he said. "I couldn't believe she was a family member. There were no tears, no disbelief. Her coldness and the lack of emotion became a central piece of the puzzle. The forensic evidence was another vital part of the case against Diane. When detectives examined the bullet wounds on the children, they noted that the shots had been fired from an unusual angle. The positions of the children in the back seat suggested that the shooter was in close proximity, very close, in fact. This meant that Diane, who had been driving the car, would have been in a perfect position to shoot her children without any struggle or interference from them. Additionally, the trajectory of the bullets, combined with the nature of the wounds, pointed to a deliberate act, not a random burst of violence. The injuries on Danny and Christy, in particular, were consistent with someone methodically firing at point-blank range. This matched perfectly with Christy's testimony that her mother was the one who had shot her. The timeline of the shooting also came under scrutiny. Investigators quickly realized that Diane's version of events didn't hold up against the physical evidence. Diane had claimed that the shooting occurred while they were on a desolate road late at night, but the location didn't match the description of where the children were found. The police began to piece together a clearer picture, and it became increasingly evident that Diane had orchestrated the entire attack, not just as a moment of rage, but as a cold-blooded act of murder. By the time Diane was formally arrested, the motive for her actions began to surface. Diane was facing serious financial troubles, and it was clear that her life had been in turmoil long before the shooting. She had been having an affair with a married man, a man who had made it clear that he didn't want her children to be part of his future. There was evidence that Diane had been seeking out a new romantic relationship, and that her children, particularly the 3 she had with her ex-husband Steve Downs, were seen as an obstacle to her happiness. Her desire to start a new life, free from the responsibilities of motherhood, became a compelling motive for the killings. Moreover, Diane had been working as a waitress, and it was no secret that she was eager to find ways to improve her life. She had been trying to get pregnant by another man, in the hopes of securing a new start. The idea of killing her children for the life she wanted became a grim possibility, and it was becoming increasingly clear to the detectives that Diane had taken extreme measures to escape her perceived burdens. As the trial of Diane Downs moved into full swing, it became evident that this case was unlike any other. The courtroom was charged with emotion, a tension hanging in the air as Diane sat before the jury. The same woman who had claimed to be the victim of a senseless crime now facing charges that would ultimately define her life. The prosecution team, led by District Attorney Fred Hugi, had the difficult task of presenting not just a case of attempted murder, but of the cold-blooded murder of Diane's youngest daughter, Cheryl. They had to prove that Diane had deliberately shot and killed her child and, with chilling precision, shot her other 2 children, leaving them to die. This was not an act of a panicked, confused mother. It was the calculated act of a woman willing to go to any lengths to rid herself of the children who, in her eyes, were an obstacle to the life she desired. Throughout the trial, Diane maintained a bizarre level of composure. Her cold demeanor in the courtroom stood in stark contrast to the emotional devastation of her daughter and the prosecutor's impassioned arguments. Diane sat in the defendant's chair, often with a blank expression, as though the gravity of the situation hadn't fully registered with her. She didn't seem to be affected by the testimony, the emotions of the witnesses, or the mounting evidence against her. At times, she would glance over at Christy, her eyes meeting the young girl's for brief, uncomfortable moments. It was a look that, to many observers, seemed almost calculating. Diane, however, appeared unfazed. She seemed, as always, detached and unable to connect with the gravity of her actions. Fred Hugi and his team built their case meticulously, using the evidence gathered by the investigators to show that Diane had planned the murders. There was no random act of violence here. Diane had staged the scene in a way that suggested premeditation. The way she shot her children, the locations of the wounds, and her lack of remorse all pointed to a mother who had made a conscious decision to kill. Forensic experts presented their findings, demonstrating that the wounds sustained by the children were consistent with someone who had known exactly where to shoot in order to cause the most damage. The angle of the bullets, the trajectory of the shots, and the way in which each child was positioned in the car all pointed to a deliberate and well-thought-out execution of the crime. Additionally, the prosecution highlighted Diane's behavior after the shooting. Her bizarre interactions with the medical staff at the hospital, her strange indifference to her children's injuries, and her calculated attempt to mislead investigators were all part of a pattern that painted her as someone who had been involved in far more than just a tragic accident. Diane had been willing to kill her own children for her own selfish reasons, and that more than anything was the motive the prosecution sought to expose. While the prosecution presented a compelling case, Diane's defense team attempted to portray her as a victim of circumstance. They tried to cast doubt on the prosecution's narrative, suggesting that Diane had been under extreme stress at the time of the shootings. They argued that her actions were the result of an unhinged mental state, driven by the pressures of her life and her failed relationship with her ex-husband, Steve Downs. However, the defense's attempts to humanize Diane fell flat. Their arguments seemed weak in the face of the overwhelming evidence, including Christy's testimony. They couldn't explain away the coldness in Diane's behavior, the lack of remorse, or the clear intent to kill. The jury saw through the defense's attempt to make Diane seem like a sympathetic figure. Instead, she came across as a woman who had calculated her actions with chilling precision. As the trial neared its conclusion, the tension in the courtroom reached a fever pitch. Diane's fate was in the hands of the jury, and everyone knew that a guilty verdict was not just a matter of evidence but of moral reckoning. Could a mother really be capable of such atrocity? Could Diane Downs be held accountable for the murder of her own daughter? The attempted murder of her 2 surviving children? After deliberating for several days, the jury came to a unanimous decision. Diane Downs was found guilty on all counts: 1 charge of murder, 2 charges of attempted murder, and 2 charges of assault. Her cold and calculated actions had been exposed for what they were: an attempt to rid herself of the very children she had once brought into the world. The trial of Diane Downs had drawn to a close, but the pain caused by her horrific actions would leave lasting scars, both in the courtroom and in the lives of those involved. After the jury returned its guilty verdict, the attention now shifted to sentencing and Diane's future as a convicted murderer. On June 17, 1984, the day Diane Downs was sentenced, the courtroom was filled with anticipation. The prosecution had argued for the harshest penalty available, but Oregon at the time did not impose the death penalty. So instead of an execution, Diane would face life in prison, but it was not without a certain finality. Her future was effectively sealed. Judge Frank Foote, presiding over the case, was firm in his assessment of Diane's crimes. With a composed and resolute voice, he read the sentence, making it clear that Diane's actions had been nothing short of monstrous. He handed down a life sentence for the murder of Cheryl Downs, the child who had been the innocent victim of her mother's rage. Additionally, Diane received 50 years for each of the attempted murders of her surviving children, Christy and Danny. The judge expressed that he hoped Diane would never again be free, conveying the court's disdain for her cold and calculated actions. At that moment, Diane's fate was sealed. She would spend the rest of her life behind bars, with no hope of ever returning to the outside world. She had been given a sentence that ensured she could not escape the consequences of her actions, though it could not undo the damage she had caused. While Diane was locked away, the lives of her surviving children, Christy and Danny, would continue to unfold, though their lives would never be the same. The tragic events of that fateful night on Sunderman Road had irreversibly altered their childhoods, but thanks to the efforts of dedicated individuals, they were able to move forward and find a sense of stability and love. In the aftermath of the trial, Fred Hugi, the prosecutor who had guided Christy through her testimony, played a pivotal role in the children's futures, In an unexpected act of compassion, Fred and his wife Joanne decided to adopt both Christy and Danny, providing them with a home filled with love, security, and the kind of care they had desperately needed. Their new life in the Hugues' home was a stark contrast to the abuse and neglect they had suffered under Diane's care. For the first time, they had a chance to heal. Danny, though physically scarred from the gunshot wound that left him paralyzed from the waist down, showed resilience and a remarkable ability to find joy in life. He would be confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life, but that did not define him. He found happiness, surrounded by the loving family that had given him a second chance. Christy, too, flourished in her new environment. As she grew older, she was able to put the trauma of her early years behind her and start building a future. No longer a child forced to relive the trauma of her mother's betrayal, Christy could finally experience what it meant to live in a stable, nurturing home. The Hugues, who had taken in these two broken children, were not just foster parents. They were the anchors that kept the children grounded and gave them the courage to move forward. In many ways, this new chapter for Christy and Danny was a testament to the human capacity for love and healing. They had been dealt a cruel hand, but thanks to the unwavering support of their adopted parents, they were able to carve out a new beginning, a life filled with hope, something their biological mother had tried so hard to destroy. While her children were able to find happiness, Diane's life in prison was anything but peaceful. She was initially sent to the Oregon Women's Correctional Center, but in 1987 she managed to escape, further solidifying her reputation as a calculating and manipulative woman. Diane's escape was brief, lasting only a few days before she was captured and sent to the high-security Clinton Correctional Institution in New Jersey, where she would spend the rest of her days. Her escape attempt would only add to the long list of reasons why she was considered a danger to society. Inside the prison, Diane's life became a subject of notoriety. She was not just another inmate. She was the infamous woman who had killed her daughter and tried to kill her other two children. Diane's actions inside the prison mirrored her life outside of it. She was manipulative, charming, and able to gain the trust of others only to exploit them for her own benefit. Even behind bars, she seemed to retain a cold detachment from the consequences of her actions, always presenting herself as the victim of an unjust world. Diane's behavior in prison, combined with her attempts at manipulating the media and those around her, ensured that she remained a controversial figure. She made multiple unsuccessful attempts to appeal her conviction, insisting that she had been wrongfully convicted, despite the overwhelming evidence against her. Her appeals were all denied, and she remained incarcerated. Though Diane was locked away, the healing process for Christy and Danny was far from over. The scars of their past were not easy to erase, and both children, now adults, would carry the weight of that trauma with them for the rest of their lives. Still, they had found love and security in their adoptive parents, Fred and Joanne Hugues, and that made all the difference. Christy, in particular, grew into a young woman who became a vocal advocate for victims of child abuse and domestic violence. Her own experiences, while horrifying, gave her a platform to speak out about the importance of protecting children and ensuring that justice is served. She used her voice to help others heal, showing that despite the darkest moments, there is always room for light. Though Diane Downs has been locked away for decades, her case continues to be one of the most infamous criminal trials in American history. The tragedy of that fateful night in 1983, when a mother decided to shoot her own children, has reverberated far beyond the courtroom, influencing how society views maternal murder, psychological manipulation, and justice itself. Even after her conviction, Diane's story has not faded from public consciousness. One of the most notable works that captured the chilling nature of the case is the best-selling book Small Sacrifices by Anne Rule. Rule, an accomplished true crime author who had an intimate understanding of the criminal mind, chronicled the entire case in painstaking detail. Small Sacrifices offered readers a deep dive into the investigation, trial, and subsequent conviction of Diane Downs, while also examining the complex emotions involved, especially those of Christy and Danny, who were forced to face their mother in the most unimaginable way. The book was later adapted into a made-for-TV movie in 1989, starring Farrah Fawcett as Diane Downs. The adaptation brought the story to an even wider audience, rekindling public fascination with the case. While the portrayal of Diane was fictionalized for dramatic effect, the essence of her chilling indifference to the deaths of her children remained accurate. But despite the ongoing media attention, Diane herself has remained a figure of deep fascination. She has granted numerous interviews from prison, always maintaining her innocence, trying to present herself as a victim of a miscarriage of justice. Her refusal to take responsibility for her actions has made her a deeply polarizing figure. While some view her as a woman who was unfairly convicted, others see her as the embodiment of evil, a mother who murdered her own flesh and blood without remorse. One of the central questions surrounding the Diane Downs case has always been, what motivated a mother to commit such horrific acts? Was she mentally ill, or was she simply a cold and calculating individual? Experts and psychologists have long debated the answer to this question. At trial, Diane's behavior was described as unusually detached, even during the most emotional moments. This led many to believe she may have been suffering from some form of personality disorder, perhaps a narcissistic personality disorder or borderline personality disorder. People with these disorders often exhibit a lack of empathy, manipulate others for personal gain, and struggle to form meaningful emotional connections. Diane herself never seemed to show true remorse for the killings, and in her interviews from prison, she has continued to maintain her innocence. This lack of empathy and self-awareness led some experts to suggest that she may have been driven by a desperate need for attention and admiration. Diane had a history of relationships with men who were largely indifferent or dismissive of her. She was desperate to maintain the attention of her lover, and some believe that her actions were an attempt to manipulate him. By pretending to be the victim of a horrific crime, she would, in her mind, become the center of his world. Her detachment from the death of her daughter and the injuries to her other children indicated a disturbing emotional coldness that is often seen in individuals with certain personality disorders. Others have suggested that Diane Downs suffered from Munchausen syndrome by proxy, MSBP, a condition in which a caregiver intentionally harms their child to gain attention and sympathy from others. While there is no definitive evidence to suggest that Diane ever exhibited the behaviors typical of MSBP, her desire to be seen as a martyr or victim could fit within the broader profile of someone who craves validation at any cost. However, it's also important to recognize that Diane's behavior may not fit neatly into any one category. It's possible that she exhibited elements of several different disorders or psychological conditions, making her actions even more difficult to understand. Regardless of the exact cause, what remains clear is that Diane Downs exhibited a profound lack of empathy and a chilling willingness to sacrifice her own children to gain personal advantage. The Diane Downs case is a tragic story that left deep emotional scars, but it is also a story of survival. Christy and Danny, two children who survived an unimaginable act of violence, have gone on to build lives of their own, proving that, even after the darkest of experiences, it is possible to heal and find happiness. Diane, on the other hand, remains a symbol of the dangers of narcissism, manipulation, and the horrifying potential for violence within the family unit. As we look back on the case, it is essential to remember the resilience of the human spirit. Though Diane's crimes may have shattered lives, they also sparked a conversation about justice, the psychology of crime, and the lengths to which individuals will go to manipulate their world. This case remains a poignant reminder that justice, while never perfect, can be a force for good. Meanwhile, Diane Downs remains incarcerated, serving a life sentence plus 50 years for the shooting deaths of her children. If you found this story as compelling and heartbreaking as we did, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more in-depth true crime analyses. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think drove Diane Downs to commit such a horrific act? How do you feel about the justice system's role in her conviction? Your insights are always welcome. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay safe and stay curious.